So hi everyone, and welcome to Utah's Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month. I'm Elizabeth Hora. I'm public archaeologist at the Utah State Historic Preservation Office, and I'm so glad that you all could make it to our program here this evening to help kick us off this month of awesome events. So tonight for our flagship event, I'm so excited to welcome Sarah Marsom and Carlos Carmonamedina to talk to us about the challenges and promise of today's historic preservation movement. Tonight, Sarah Marsom will introduce you to the history of the American preservation movement and share an empowering vision for today's historic preservation movement. Sarah is a heritage resource consultant whose passion is increasing representation of the histories of historically underrepresented groups and inspiring a new generation of people to use historic preservation in their own communities. She's been honored with an American Express Aspire Award, and her projects have received recognition by the National Council on Public History. She is joined by Carlos Carmonamedina, a visual and graphic artist with a passion for illustration, print, and social media. Also, both of these folks have been on the National Trust for Historic Places' 40 Under 40 People Saving Places list, so you know that they're the real deal. We're also joined here tonight by our own Dr. Chris Merritt, Utah's State Historic Preservation Officer, and he will be helping us with the Q&A period. All right, so I think you guys have all heard enough from me. I'll turn this over to Sarah. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being virtually in Utah tonight, although I'm physically here in Columbus, Ohio. Like Elizabeth said, I'm a heritage resource consultant. That's a made-up title that I gave myself. But really, I try to creatively find ways to connect people to the past. And I'm going to start this presentation with a little bit of a personal anecdote. Please just follow along. This presentation is going to have some uncomfortable comments probably, and then a bit of whimsy. And I think that probably perfectly encapsulates who I am. So let's start by going to Saccatone, Arizona. This is the C.H. Cook Memorial Presbyterian Church, constructed in 1918. The congregation was formed in the late 1800s, and this is said to have been the oldest standing Presbyterian church when it was constructed, or up until the very recent past. Now, this is a church that was constructed by my great-great-grandfather. He was a missionary who went here to Saccatone, Arizona to convert the Pima people into the Presbyterian religion. And this church stood for many years, garnering a historic designation. It was on the National Register of Historic Places, designated in 1975. So one of the earlier nominations in Arizona. And it was specifically designated for its architectural significance. You see this mission-style building. It appears to be adobe from the outside, which is accurate, but it had its height was made possible by 2-foot thick concrete walls. So while it was paying an homage to traditional building styles and building techniques, it was utilizing more contemporary materials to achieve the functional goals of this congregation. And like I said, during its designation, it was said to be significant for its architecture. But I don't know, maybe you're like me and you have been exploring your family history over the years. Last year, the pandemic happened, so I had a bit more time to explore the history of this building, this place that I would visit on family vacations, almost as a family pilgrimage. And what my research found is these are my relatives. In the photo, these were the missionaries, and these were people that, while they did wonderful things like advocating at Congress to retain water rights for the reservation and the indigenous people, because farmers in Arizona were trying to extract water rights for their private gain, they also were participating in Indian boarding schools. Now, these boarding schools relocated young individuals from their familiar homes and renamed them and tried to basically extract any remaining memory or aspect of the culture that they grew up in away from them. And the Native children were forced to attend church every single week at this church. So what I'm saying is the National Register, it had value, it has value, but it does not always tell the full stories. It does not always tell the difficult stories. And that's going to be a common thread in what we communicate throughout, or what I communicate throughout this presentation. And I hope that you will throw questions. I hope you will engage in the chat. Please don't take anything what I say as gospel. I'm just here to encourage you to think, to reflect on preservation and how it's evolved over time. And it's really important because when that nomination was written in 1975, it was noted in the nomination form that the structure was already neglected. It already was experiencing vandalism. And the entire time I've ever visited this building, it was boarded up. So it was honestly no surprise when it caught fire in 2019. It caught fire the month after the last time that I actually visited it. And I was telling this story to a fellow preservationist about how I was feeling very conflicted about this building, this monument to my family's history, but not just my family's history, but the history of the indigenous people of the area and the greater Southern Arizona area. And they were like, well, Sarah, why don't you go and preserve this building? Why don't you try and take it from this burnt shell into something else? And, I reflected over drawing, like you can see in your screen, Carlos is reflecting over drawing. And this reflection really, to me, reinforced that preservation, as we do it over the years, as we continue to reflect on it, it will evolve. And it has evolved to the point where today, a lot of us are recognizing the importance in what the community wants. And you know what? The community let this building sat vacant for years. And, some of that may be tied to finances. Some of that may be tied to potential long-term historical trauma. I don't know. But, the community at this point has not chosen to save the building. So, I want us to just kind of, throughout this presentation, just reflect. Who are the people who should be doing the preserving? Or how do we do the preserving? Or what's left out of our preservation efforts? Because it's really important to note that we are still in our country actively erasing history. As we all saw in the past week or so, the horrific graffiti done over the petroglyphs at Moab in Utah. People are still proactively trying to erase history. So let's proactively preserve it, but as we're proactively preserving it, let's evolve, let's learn. And I know that preservationists know nothing better than learning from the past to benefit the future. So let's take a look at the history of the preservation movement as we tell the story today. We typically tell the story beginning with Ann Pamela Cunningham and the Mt.Vernon Ladies Association. Ann Pamela Cunningham ran a successful marketing campaign to save George Washington's Mt.Vernon homestead in Virginia. She engaged through newspaper clippings and women's groups to gain the funds to acquire the property, to save it from being just evaporating back into nature. And then fast forward 100 years and we have Jane Jacobs, the former architecture critic turned community activist who proactively and protest, and she was arrested, and she fought to save Greenwich Village from urban renewal, which inspired her to write The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Jane Jacobs reflected the modern preservation movement, the one that looks at walkability, at small businesses. It looks at the overall health that you get by preserving structures of the past and dense neighborhoods. By preserving these areas, you create community. And that's a big part of what preservation is. So these are arguably two of the most well-known women in the history of the preservation movement. If you had to give a pop quiz to any preservation student, they would know who these are. But there were contemporaries working alongside them who were lesser known. In Texas in the 1800s through the early 1900s was Adina de Zavala. We can thank Adina de Zavala for saving the Alamo. She saved the Alamo and extant buildings. She fundraised for it. She community organized. There were even songs written about her efforts. And then she would go on to launch Texas's first historical marker program. Across the country from Jane Jacobs was Aurora Vargas in Los Angeles. Aurora was fighting to save the Chavez Ravine, the predominantly Mexican immigrant working class neighborhood where Dodgers Stadium stands today. Initially, the homes were being purchased by the city of Los Angeles for what they said was going to be a public housing project, a common stance by people advocating for urban renewal. But along the way, these people's homes were demolished, and instead of housing, it was replaced by the baseball stadium, Dodgers Stadium. And Aurora, like Jane Jacobs, was put in prison for her efforts. Aurora stayed in jail for longer, though, probably tied to her socioeconomic status and potentially her race as well. That's just my positing. But Aurora was in prison for a month because of her not wanting to sell her home, not wanting to leave her home, not wanting to lose her community, where if you look up the Chavez Ravine, it was a working class neighborhood, but it was a community. And you'll find wonderful garbs of teenagers in prom dresses and celebrations. And it was just decimated by the city of Los Angeles. So we have a wide range of people who were influencing how the preservation movement was developing. And it was largely being developed by volunteers, by grassroots activists. And they were developing these tools like historic designations and historic markers. And all of these were codified and became official with the National Preservation Act in 1966. There were locally designated historic districts prior to the National Preservation Act. There were historic markers before the National Preservation Act, but the National Preservation Act really created the governmental regulations, which we know today. The National Register of Historic Places, which designated the C.H. Cook Memorial Church, and many properties probably near you. Section 106, which protects above ground and below ground history for any project that is utilizing federal dollars. We have all these tools that were created, and they're now managed under the National Park Service and also by your state historic preservation office. And Chris, I'm sure, will be happy to answer any specific questions about Utah's. So that's the way we've told the story, and we're starting to see people rewriting the history of preservation, which is invaluable. And it's really important as we reconstruct preservation to really assess how the movement was created, how it's evolved, where it was shortcomings, where it's been successful, so that we can successfully evolve the movement moving into the future. So Whitney Martinko recently published this year a book, Historic Real Estate Market Morality and the Politics of Preservation in the Early United States. And you can visit her Twitter for a coupon code. I don't know Whitney, so she probably just thinks I'm a creep on the internet for how much I'm plugging her book, but I want everybody to read it because it dissects really interesting parts of how indigenous mounds here in Ohio actually led to how cities were built and how people would acquire properties that had pieces of the past and that gave them clout. It really presents a different way of preservation, whether through necessity or whether through economy, and how that started as early as the United States actual founding. And we haven't really explored that history of preservation. So I recommend exploring that book. But I also encourage you, as we think of what preservation is and isn't, it's as simple as that recipe card passed down from your grandmother. That's preservation, and that's something that's been being done for hundreds of years. So as we reconsider what preservation is or should be, some of that's tied to architecture and our built environment. That's largely what we think of as preservation. Maybe it's a Quonset hut turned movie theater in Nebraska, or a house clad in beer cans like our center image in Houston, Texas. Or maybe this reimagining is recognizing there's history underneath that parking lot, as you can see in South Dakota. They realized the old Chinatown was underneath a parking lot during construction. So these are just things that we need to remember to consider all types of history, and you never know where you may find it. So as we go into considering how we want to reconstruct preservation, I like to think of it like a lustron. Now, a lustron, if you're not familiar, is basically one of the biggest architecture follies in America's history. Lustrons were created after World War II in response to the housing crisis, the need for housing. So a idea man came up with this concept of a porcelain enamel prefab house, a wonderfully innovative idea. You just could build a lustron on a concrete slab in a day. In the blink of an eye, you could have a building, you could have a new home for someone. But as you can see in my doodle, the Lustron Corporation only lasted from 1947 to 1950. They could never manufacture the number of houses that were required. But you can find lustrons across the country speckled around. And these lustrons, I like to think of them kind of like preservation. They were an innovative idea worth exploring. And it's an idea that has resonated with people. But in the lustron case, within 3 years, it showed didn't fully resonate with people. But today in preservation, more than 150 years after what we would say is the formal founding of preservation with the Mt.Vernon Ladies Association, we're showing, is it really resonating with people? And we can say, we can successfully say that our preservation audience is not as broad as we want. We don't have as many preservation advocates as we want. So let's look to the lustron. What did they do right? What did they do wrong? I'd say definitely having metal walls where you can't put a nail in, that was wrong. So that was more obvious. But if you look at the lustron on the right, and that's actually one of my neighbor's homes, if you go inside, they drywalled over the metal walls, and now they can hang pictures. So sometimes you just have to evolve your existing structure, our existing structure of preservation or lustron, for contemporary use and future enjoyment and future benefit. Or you potentially need to completely deconstruct and turn it into a chair, turn it into something else that's useful and beneficial. And let's just consider the ways we can reconstruct. I choose to start our reconstruction by redefining who is a historic preservationist. I believe that a historic preservationist is an individual who believes in saving the physical or intangible elements of the past for the betterment of the future. And there's 3 types of preservationists. There's passive. So a passive preservationist is a person who chooses to eat at that old diner on Main Street because they just love that greasy burger. But, they're not necessarily going because it's in an old building or that the diner has history, but they're still investing their money and time into that space without making those connections. And then we have recreational preservationists. Recreational preservationists are the people who are not compensated for their love of preservation. These could be people who choose on vacation to visit a historic house museum, or the person who opens their home during an annual house and garden tour, or volunteers for a nonprofit. That's a recreational preservationist. And then there's professional preservationists. It's people like me who are compensated for their labor. It's the people who write historic tax credit applications, your wonderful SHPO employees. There is a range of types of preservationists, and it's important that we acknowledge it, because once more, the history of the preservation movement reveals it's not a professional title, it's a belief structure, it's a movement. So let's look at innovative preservation projects across the country. Here we have an example from Better Days 2020, a wonderful Utah nonprofit that was launched specifically to preserve women's history. And I just love these illustrations by Brooke Smart that they commissioned to help tell the stories of different women from the past and the impact they made. So Better Days 2020 specifically was tied to commemorating suffragists, the women who fought for the right to vote in Utah, but they are expanding and continuing to find ways to preserve women's history, regardless to if it was tied to the 19th Amendment. So one of the reasons why preserving women's history is a sign of the future of preservation, it's because less than 10% of National Register of Historic Places designations, less than 10% are considered significant for history tied to women, LGBTQ individuals or community members, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and Pacific Islander Americas, or other peoples of color's history. Less than 10%. So it's radical to be preserving women's history. And that if we look at the history of preservation, we've fallen short. So, this may not seem too out of the box, but really reconstructing the preservation movement requires including all types of histories. And if you can do it creatively, like Better Days 2020, even better. Old Salem Museum and Gardens was one of the first locally designated districts in the entire country. And the Museum and Gardens were established in 1950. It had historically told the story of Moravian settlers. This was a religious sect similar-ish to Quaker, but they did fight in the wars. So Old Salem told this story of Moravian settlers. And if you went to visit the Museum and Gardens, you could see blacksmiths in action. And it's very much what you think of as a traditional living museum in history. But since coming under the leadership of Frank Bagnon, the author of The Anarchist's Guide to Historic House Museum, it now proactively tells the story of the free and enslaved African Americans who lived there. Or last year, when their visitors, plummeted because of the pandemic, they recognized that these decorative gardens, which are beautiful to walk through, weren't benefiting anywhere for anyone. So they chose to convert these decorative gardens into food gardens so that these food gardens could provide to the local land bank systems. So, let's think not only about expanding our narrative, but also how do our historic sites go beyond frozen moments of time and provide benefit to communities in a variety of ways. Telling stories of the past is incredibly helpful, incredibly beneficial, but our historic sites need to connect to people beyond the history enthusiasts. Or how about Repurposed Savannah? Many cities are starting to explore landfill requirements or restrictions, how much waste a construction site can give. So Repurposed Savannah is actually a construction crew that specifically, if a building is going to be demolished, they come in and they deconstruct and save the building materials for future rehab projects, future new construction projects. If you're on this video, I am sure you have experienced the loss of a building. All of us have, and it's gut-wrenching. And you look at that pile of rubble at the end of the day, and you're like, I lost this battle. But no, Repurposed Savannah is finding the silver lining and saving things so that they can have new life. So even if we lose our traditional preservation battle, this is an opportunity to save future buildings, one piece at a time. Or maybe you should consider exploring with the Decay Devils in Gary, Indiana. This group of urban explorers started out as a group of friends who like to explore vacant buildings together. They are the most fun bunch, if I do say so. And they realized that by exploring decaying buildings, they had gained a greater appreciation for historic structures of the past. So they formed a nonprofit and they bought the center image. They bought the old Union Station in Gary from the city for $10. And they have slowly but surely been stabilizing it and creating activities there and installing art. They have been connecting with people through arts and creative engagement strategies. Like you can't see it in this image, but if you look at their Instagram account, you can find images of where they've done oversized chessboards out front of the terminal. They do art tours, once again, considering how we engage with people and draw them to place in new and different strategies. And they haven't rushed into fixing up the Union Station because they have been strategically doing community engagement strategies with people of all ages to determine the best and highest use. They're not pretending to be the experts. They're recognizing that the community deserves to have a voice in this structure. Or sometimes the simplest thing of all to do is to just provide support systems for people. The Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium does just that. This group emerged from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And this group specifically works with tiny nonprofits. You know, a tiny nonprofit that doesn't have staff and is volunteer-led. How the heck do they have the time and energy to understand Instagram or to pursue grants or to continue their education in preservation and storytelling? It's really difficult for these small, tiny nonprofits to accomplish that. So the African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium, I'll acknowledge that's a mouthful. What they do is they help these itty bitty nonprofits get the grants. They provide the support system. They connect the individuals and the organizations to resources and raise awareness for them. From Montgomery to Birmingham, Selma, all over Alabama's Black Belt. This sometimes preservation can be about who successfully saved the building. Who got the award? Who gets the glamour and the acknowledgement for the work that they did? But in reality, preservation is a team sport, and this consortium is a wonderful example of how we all benefit by teamwork and uplifting and empowering and sharing resources. We can also just share resources by creating easy to accessible guides. The San Francisco Legacy Business Directory is not only a directory where you can easily find long-standing businesses from the contemporary past all the way to 100 plus years old, but they also provide financial incentives to help keep these legacy businesses in place and active, and they've been really proactive throughout the entire pandemic to ensure these smaller businesses stay a community benefit. House of Tulip is a wonderful new community development corporation. Community development corporations aren't anything new, but what House of Tulip is doing is they are acquiring vacant or underutilized old structures in New Orleans, and they are utilizing them as a way to give housing to trans and non-binary individuals who are underhoused. If my neighborhood, the ones next to it, I know there's some vacant houses, so why are we letting vacant houses sit when we let people not have housing or not access to housing? Let's help people get on their feet and use our community development tools for the greater good, and that's what House of Tulip's doing. And there's crowdsourced projects like Dr. Andrea Roberts' Texas Freedom Colonies, where you can submit information you know about Black cemeteries. You can submit information about your family history there. Everybody is the expert in this situation. And Dr. Andrea Roberts recognizes it's not just the people who know how to research the old deeds books and Sanborn fire insurance maps. There are stories of value from all types of people, and we need to be proactively collecting them. And as we proactively collect our stories, we also have to reconsider how we tell these stories, right? You know, I had the fortune, and I'm going to pick on Kansas for a little bit. So I had the fortune of going to Kansas a couple of years ago for their statewide preservation conference, and it was a wonderful event. But I'm walking around town and I'm seeing all these references to Gunsmoke. And I've seen Gunsmoke. I'm sure you might have seen it on TV too. But oh my gosh, there are so many sites like that that use outdated references to engage people. Yes, Star Wars is timeless, but is Gunsmoke the right Western reference to still be using? I'd rather hear about Little Nas and Old Town Road, or let's keep up on contemporary ways to engage. And let's break away from our period of significance. Let's break away of the significance according to the National Register. The Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice is the childhood home of Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray was a civil rights activist. She actually knew Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She would go on to become an Episcopalian reverend. She was a poet. Pauli did basically everything. So Pauli, being such a dynamic person, really made it so the staff was a bit confused. Where do I go? How do we tell these stories? Do we tell them chronologically? No. So they engaged with community, with stakeholders, with people of all ages and all backgrounds to assess and reflect on how to tell the stories. And instead of telling things in a chronological method, like we typically do at historic sites, they tell things thematically. They tell things based on specific topics, and they weave a narrative. It's not linear, it's weaving, and which really helps connect the dots from past to present day. So those are just some sites and organizations that inspire me, that cause me to continue to reflect on what the future of preservation could look like, what we should be considering. Because the tools that we have, it's not like I'm saying throw them out the window. I'll never say that. But do I want to be the person who keeps a building from being saved because I'm trying to die on the hill to save those windows? No, I'd rather a building be activated and engaged and a part of the building. We need to reconsider why we're doing this work. Are we preserving buildings for an individual's property, or are we doing it for the larger collective benefit of our communities? We are preserving the past, physical and intangible, because of the larger value it has for our communities, whether we're looking at physical health, mental health, because yes, preserving all histories has a mental health benefit. By cultivating empathetic communities, there are so many reasons why we do this. So what else should we be considering as we work to create this inclusive and equitable preservation movement? Again, we know stories, but what are the stories we don't know? In this instance, we know about the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. We know about the colonial aspects of it, but do you know about the LGBTQ leather bars in Philadelphia? I didn't until the other year. You know, let's make sure we're telling all types of stories, because again, not everybody's going to resonate with that one narrative. So let's look at all the different narratives of place and consider them. And while these buildings are about equal-ish in age, they tell wildly, wildly different narratives in the best of ways. But some of the stories that we tell are difficult, and some of the stories that we tell, we need to be reckoning in a variety of ways. When I look to Manzanar National Historic Site, it is not just a difficult story of when Japanese people were forcibly removed during their homes from World War II. It's also a wonderful example of how language matters. And I say that because here in America, we largely call these internment camps, when in reality, they fit perfectly the definition of concentration camps. Now, reflect on that just for a second. How does internment camp make you feel versus concentration camp? There's a wild guttural difference. Like you can feel the difference between those two words based on our connotations of those. But Japanese peoples were displaced in this time and put in concentration camps. They fit that fits the definition. People died there, they were forced into labor. It was done because of politics. So language matters. Do you say underrepresented? There are a lot of grants by the National Park Service to help pay for underrepresented works. What does underrepresented even mean? It means that there's less of a certain type of story. Why aren't we saying historically excluded? That is a wildly different way to phrase it, but it's a more accurate way to phrase it. So when we're telling the narrative, let's think through the language that we use. Let's not use acronyms. I got a real beef with acronyms because they create barriers of language, but also let's consider using the words that accurately reflect what happened. Yes, it's okay to say we historically excluded those stories because we are proactively working to include them now. It's okay to acknowledge faults of the past. I will happily tell you stories of me accidentally putting my foot in my mouth and me learning how to pull it out, but it's because we have to acknowledge that preservation has to evolve and learn. And as we acknowledge that preservation has to evolve and learn, we look to sites like Oregon Pike Cactus National Monument in southern Arizona. And this is a real difficult one because the border wall recently ripped through this national monument, desecrating some indigenous cultural sites that were below ground, some were above ground, and it also destroyed many protected saguaro cactus and just the cultural landscape up broad. So, this difficult conversation ties to how did our tools come short? This is a national monument. That's one of the highest levels of honor you can get. So how was the petroglyph at Moab, vandalized? How was this national monument impacted? Let's reflect on our tools, acknowledge they need growth. It's okay, we're all growing together. And we have to grow because we want to cultivate future activists, like this group of children in Cleveland who are learning about urbanism from Jane Jacobs, or Mary Lou Seidel, a wonderful preservation advocate in Chicago, teaching her granddaughter about Jane as well. These are the future advocates, and we're only going to lure them in if we understand that preservation can and should evolve, to tell full stories, to listen to people, to understand that just because you have the quote unquote right degree, you may not necessarily be the expert in that neighborhood. So we want to cultivate these future advocates. And some of the ways that we want to do that is through transparency. This is a postmodern building that is actually, as of yesterday, one of Landmarks Illinois' top 10 endangered buildings. It's for sale, so if you have a few $1 million laying around, buy it. And it's a very physically transparent building, but like the transparency is transparency from showing how much you can make by working in preservation, revealing compensation, because how the heck is someone supposed to know that this is a viable career path if we don't show them that they can be compensated for their labor? It's transparency in acknowledging our nonprofit is coming up short because of the pandemic. We had less visitors this year. I'm open and transparent that we're struggling. We have to be transparent as a preservation movement, not only just celebrating our wins, but also acknowledging our shortcomings. And that's okay. Because if you're here, you're a preservationist, for sure. You want to be spending your evening with me unless you were a nerd, and you're my kind of nerd. So you have value. The work you do is value. Nemisha Bott on the left, if you see a presentation from mine, chances are there's a photo of Nemisha because I love her. She is a sweet angel and a wonderful arts and architecture librarian. When I first met Nemisha, she would not even identify as a preservationist, even though she's someone who donates to preservation nonprofits, volunteers for them, has served on the boards of them, but she didn't feel confident and comfortable, even though she was doing the valuable labor. So we have to remember to celebrate the people doing the work, celebrate our wins, be okay to learn and heal from our losses. It's really important for us to just celebrate and value the people doing the work, because this is hard work. We are fueled by passion. We are passionate people, but I want to see what our ambition is. And our ambition to change the preservation movement should include fun. It should include whimsy. It should include sewing pillows in a vacant mid-century mall to test out whether or not a storefront can become a makerspace. We have to make it so that the preservation movement is beyond bureaucratic paperwork. Yes, it has value, but this is fun, and there's so many access points to make it lively and engaging and worth being more than just a tool for an individual's benefit. Preservation truly has a benefit and an ability for all. So I'll share my information also in the chat. I'm a person on the internet, a child of MySpace, so you can find me on Instagram, LinkedIn, all that happy stuff. But I'm really happy to introduce Carlos Carmonamedina, sorry. So Carlos is a wonderful illustrator based in Washington, D.C. I met him thanks to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, recognizing the value of his art as a storytelling tool in D.C. And you can see a couple of his pieces up on the screen. So Carlos has been sketching throughout this entire presentation, and we're going to have just a quick chat before we open it up for the Q&A. And I will say, since I have Dumbarton Oaks here on the slide, they currently have a digital Women in Preservation exhibit up. So you can see it in person, but also you can visit it online. There's a video, there's photos. It's a really nice small exhibit. I recommend digesting it. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Carlos and I will chat, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, Carlos.
Finally showing my face.
Yeah, I'd also love it if you maybe show us some of the stuff that you were sketching on, and was there anything in particular that stuck with you? Or
I mean, I was just like listening to what you were saying and some ideas that came to mind based on your presentation. And I'm not really sure if you folks can see it. If it's not, is it mirrored? Is it mirrored?
no, it looks great.
Okay.
It's
so
legible.
I'm just gonna be like passing some of the things that I've been doing, and then I'm gonna scan them and work on them and then share them with you folks later. And this is,
Yeah, I really think it's okay to acknowledge the past is uncomfortable, because if we don't acknowledge it, then we end up with this Confederate monument debacle where people are just physically removing, things. We have to confront discomfort head on.
well, I think that you need also like a good angle. I mean, you make a lot of emphasis on telling different stories and giving voice to those that historically have been neglected. I think is the right way to do. Like, yes, if you want to keep the Confederate monument, why don't you just have another one as big that next to it that could like tell a different version of what they are trying to say. Like at the end of the day, we as society, we need to like start thinking on who do we want to be known for, or what do we want to know for. Yeah, I mean, I really like how you went and started like the history of preservation and what's exactly where all these ideas come from. It's a relatively modern idea, no?
So Carlos, I'd be interested in, how do you define preservation? Because you've lived in Mexico, you've lived in Europe, you've lived in the US. Have you seen differences in preservation that has informed how you perceive it?
I mean, being in, and you're talking about the States or like in the idea in general?
Just in general, preservation.
I mean, preservation, I think, is very tied to economic development. It's at the end of the day, it's a relatively narcissist idea of how can we define ourselves based on the amount of energy and money that we want to put into saving things that they are naturally destined to decay. But there are things that communities and whole countries have decided to make the biggest monuments of our society, of our way of being. But then at the same time, I was like, I don't know, like looking at Lord Byron doing graffiti in the Temple of Poseidon. It's like, those are the kind of things that, it's relatively recent how we acknowledge those things that we have always had in front of us. And I think it's also cyclical. You know, you lose interest 100 years about those monuments, and then there is a new movement resurfing now and then.
I agree. And I also feel like we're starting to see, you know, in the early 1900s, like with the Lustron, you know, people were trying to create things where you didn't have to maintain. And now we're back, you know, people still want the things that they don't have to maintain as much, but there's a real movement to go back into maintenance, whether it's mending clothes or, you know, handmade goods as a whole, as a art. And yeah, I feel like people will ebb and flow, but hopefully we all do better, right? We'll learn with each iteration.
Yeah, I mean, I always try to like, I'm always a little bit cynical because I also, it's hard to leave the bubble where I live, like the art bubble. And then once you do, you realize that people are not very engaged with these conversations. And that's why I admire very much the kind of work that you are doing on putting your ideas out there in Instagram and using the resources that people are using, because at the end of the day, I'm not really sure if like conferences or the format of academic conference is any useful, you know?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So when I first started working in preservation, like when I was 19, I did more what people see as traditional preservation work, you know, working at a house museum. And then eventually I worked with design guidelines and things. And the past few years, I've had some people tell me that I'm not doing preservation work because I've kind of started to go into unconventional directions. With like last year, I did a lot of work tied to the history of banners for advocating for voting rights and teaching people how to make banners to advocate for themselves or to just bring a smile onto their face. But I think it really just goes to show like, we have to be trying these things. Not everything's going to be a home run, but we have to try these things. Otherwise, like you said, you stay in a little bubble, and what's the point of just talking to the people in your bubble?
What's your point in like more radical activism on, you know, taking monuments by storm or like buildings and making your voice heard? I mean, there are several like movements that the past year that have been also, you know, inspiring a little bit more of an active force.
That's a real big can of worms. I understand why people choose to do more radical actions. If you're not feeling listened to, and let's look at numbers, for example, less than 20% of representation at the federal level is women, and less than that is people of color. If you're not seeing yourself represented or feeling like your voice is heard, it's like we were talking earlier about about like your toddler's temper tantrums, you know. I'm not equating the civil unrest to temper tantrums, but I'm thinking like, you know, like the only way you know how to react may be a physical action when your words aren't being listened to. For better or for worse, that's, you know.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking specifically, for example, the riots on 1968 here in Washington, D.C. after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And those riots, you know, destroy a whole community as well. I mean, there are things that they have a lot of consequences that sometimes when you are enraged, you don't know how to measure well. But there are also, yeah.
No, I think if I went and chose another career path, I would try and teach somewhere between K and 12 so that I could try and reform history curriculum to include all of this stuff. So Chris, do we have any questions from the general public or?
Yeah, we actually have a couple in the hopper, but I just wanted to first thank you both, Sarah. That was everything I hope it would be. Is kind of re-envisioning how we interact with preservation, and I appreciate everybody that's joining us tonight. So, and Carlos, thank you for your stuff too. That was great, and that interaction is wonderful. So I'll throw out the first question. You guys have kind of talked about it. Have you seen good examples of communities reconciling with their Confederate monuments?
I do not think we have figured out the right solution. I'll say that. I think that the conversation, though, at least has entered another layer in public stratosphere. It was even this past season on Southern Charm on Bravo, it was one of the conversation points, actually, because one of the individuals on there, her great grandpa or whatever, that great grandpa, there was a Confederate monument dedicated to him. So, like, it's even in pop culture now, the discussions of whether they get torn down. So I really don't feel like there's a great example, but I will send a link to an art studio that I think is doing wonderful communications of the discourse around it. They've been creating art prints of the graffiti. They've been creating community education events. I think that we need to see more of a conversation and more of a public forum to be able to viably decide, do you keep the base and remove the statue? You keep the base and that's a piece of it, and then you install something new to tell a different story. I think we're choosing removal or stay when I think there's a lot of in-between opportunities.
Yeah, and it feels too that a lot of these are situational. There's no one simple fix for all of these, based on the community, based on the language, the imagery, that really all tools are in place. Just for the benefit of you all and also the audiences, we have one of the largest Native American massacres ever in US history was just across the border in Preston, Idaho. And just this January, the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, who's had a monument there since the 1930s, have removed the original plaque and its text and put a more socially and historically appropriate plaque in its place. But that was a very controversial spot for many, many years at the Bear River Massacre site.
I really recommend checking out Monuments Lab. Monument Lab, they recently received a very large grant to start doing more monument work beyond the Confederate monuments and discourse. And they've been doing some really interesting research on all different strategies. So I'll link them in the chat as well to that Richmond-based art group.
Thank you.
Speaking of recontextualizing historic interpretive plaques, I was in Wyoming and I saw a plaque from the 1900s, and then there was a plaque dedicated to that plaque to be like, this was a historic plaque, and then there was like a third plaque with a different narrative. So, sometimes you just have to acknowledge that things are evolving.
Yeah. Jumping into another Q&A question. So this one's a little bit more on the regulatory end. Is, in the Historic Preservation Act and some of the supporting guidance, we use a 50-year rule guidance to kind of look at sites and buildings and districts for, significance. So do you think that 50-year rule should be removed altogether or reduced in time? And there was a second follow-up. And how do you think that would move the preservation movement forward?
The 50-year rule, and this is what I hear from people at different SHPOs, it's not a firm rule. It's just kind of a guideline. I think that we need to destroy it, set it on fire, throw it out back. Let's pretend it. Because especially if we want to start preserving things from the 60s, 70s, and 80s with, again, contemporary building materials that are degrading in different rates and different ways, by the time we reach 50 years, it may be too far gone. So that's from a practical standpoint. But it also inhibits our ability to recognize history as it's happening. And this could be architecture significance. Look up the Longaberger basket in Ohio. It is a building literally that looks like a basket. And that's actually going to be getting historic tax credits, even though it was constructed in the 1990s to be reused. Or think about it, the designations in response to 9/11, you have to be able to acknowledge some things are as significant as now, or there's a history of preserving presidential homes. We're going to be having presidents living in McMansions any minute. So those homes may not be 50 years by the time they're president. So, there's all these different ways we can look at it, but it's also tied to us needing to move beyond historic and looking more to important. So what's important to the community? And important to the community may have a radically different age. It may be physical, it may be intangible. So let's recognize the important things and moving away from historic with a 50-year rule.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sarah, because we actually, we have worked on one of those underrepresented communities grants from the National Park Service, and we're currently building with a consultant a context for Latinx properties in Utah. And what we're actually finding is none of them are meeting that threshold of age. And a lot of those that did have been demolished, before they reached that age. And so it's kind of erasing an entire, community's history by the time it falls into our normal toolbox for preservation.
And what is integrity even? That's a big can of worms that we won't solve tonight, but we have to, I think integrity also will continue to exclude a lot of these narratives if we're going off of things. Would we rather that house had sat vacant and pristine for 100 years or 50 years or 20 years? Or would we rather have had people living in it that entire time, adding to the story? I would have rather had people living in it and maintaining it to the best of their abilities, even if it isn't the quote unquote preservation guidelines way.
Cool. Another question, and I'm respecting our presenters' times tonight. We're kind of winding down to our timeline, and remember, these guys are on East Coast time, so we appreciate them spending their evening with us. But this is a big one, so I'm going to use my reading voice here. A question, comment for discussion. The preservation community tends to get caught up on built heritage alone versus the seeing how intangible and natural heritage interaction enrich it. I think that is a huge barrier in how we advocate and protect for preservation projects, but can exclude communities, specifically historically excluded, from engaging within preservation. So a question, how can we broaden this idea?
Again, it leads to how we creatively connect people. Ghost structures is one. Look to Santa Monica at the work that Allison Rose has done in partnership with an artist. All of the Black housing that was there historically is gone. So they've created ghost structures to bring them to life, so that's opportunities. How do we interpret spaces so that people can engage with something? Is it virtual? Is it bringing something to life? You bring somebody physically there and then they VR to see what it looked like in the past, or how people were protesting in that plaza. What are the ways that we can better interpret? Because again, preservation is not separate than public history and interpretation. So how do we better intersect those to activate the natural heritage, the cultural landscapes? How do we better bring things to life? Nina Simon, I really recommend reading her book, The Art of Relevance. Nina is an advocate for partying in cemeteries. Cemeteries were our original public parks. They are not supposed to be places that we avoid for fear of ghosts or what have you. How do we bring places to life? And a lot of it's by the traditional ceremonies. A lot of it's by activities and experiential opportunities, or, passive interpretation out of the box, like a ghost house.
I'm going to piggyback also on Sarah's comment here and try to partner also with, I really believe fiction, people who create writers, movies that are relevant to, very relevant to preserve the sense of the city and the buildings. Go to Paris and then you will see this huge ugly structure in the center, which is the Eiffel Tower. And one of the reasons why it's so adored by a lot of people is because it has appeared in all these movies and it's always the background, in photos and stuff. And so if we invite our artists and writers to create more pieces of work where people can reflect and see their city more on a daily basis, I think that would also be useful for communities to get attached to those, discourses that they see all the time.
Very much agree.
Yeah, I want to throw another comment in here. Is I'm an archaeologist by training, and I recently started working much more closely with our building staff when I became the SHPO, and it's been very interesting. The sphere that I was trained in is so different than the sphere of built environment folks. I mean, to the point where there's very little interdisciplinary training occurring in colleges of thinking in broad sense what heritage looks like, and I think that has consequences, but also some of the very draconian rules I've seen that we have to work under as a SHPO with historic tax credits, for instance, that a project could be excluded from preservation because they put a mural on a side of a property. There's a lot of embedded structural issues that I think continue to plague us, and I was just wondering if you had some interesting ways to think about how we can skirt the rules, change the rules, or find creative ways to do better preservation by being more flexible and less draconian.
I'd like to start by saying my undergrad is in Parks and Rec Management, and I did not take a single history class, preservation class, and the National Park Service is our biggest caretakers of cultural legacy. And I have yet to find a single Parks and Rec program in the entire country that teaches a preservation course. We have lots of shortcomings in creating an intersectional field and creating our little bubbles, our silos, archaeology, preservation, beyond. So how do we move beyond the limitations? And I can give great examples of historic districts that have moved beyond painted murals to vinyl murals or wheat paste, things that are temporary. I don't know what the right answer is, though, for changing the federal rules. So I think it's starting really at working on the local level so that we can reassess our local guidelines, our local restrictions. And at the end of the day, and Chris, don't get mad at me, local is what matters because a local designation has more prevention to demolition or physical harm than a national designation. Local has more of an ability to have volunteers or staff to bring a thing to life. So you can utilize your state and federal resources and their skills and knowledge. But if we really focus on shifting our local teeth so that they're a little softer and a little bit more flexible, then I think that will lead to the national change long-term, because they'll basically be forced into a corner to change, right? Well, all of our local designated buildings now are following these rules. I guess we need to finally reevaluate how to make things ADA compliant.
Oh, there's no way that comment made me mad. That makes me very happy. As a SHPO, we get two types of phone calls: the folks that want something on the National Register because they think it's going to save it, and the folks that don't want it on the register because they think it's going to save it. In reality, that doesn't matter. The federal designation does nothing. It's those local ordinances, those local politics, those local preservationists that are going to make that difference. So I completely 100% agree. And I like the bottom up approach.
We're the ones who are, at the end of the day, the taxpayers, right? They'll have to listen to us in our local community.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, if you've got a subversive way of making positive change, Chris is probably on board for that.
That sounds very bad to be recorded and put on a state website, but
that'll be edited out.
I appreciate that, Elizabeth. All right, we're about 6 minutes over our allotted time tonight. I'm going to do a last quick call for any last questions. I'm not seeing much. But I would love, Sarah and Carlos, if you wanted to give us your last bit of advice, perspective, anything. I'll give the last few minutes to you both.
So, yeah, I'd love to hear from you, Carlos. You've come to preservation from an entirely different art space world. Like, what would you like all of us to walk away inspired with?
I'm more in the creation side. so once that I put things out there, I don't really care about the life of my works or my drawings. This Mexican muralist Jose Clemente Orozco, which is made that these like beautiful murals in the most important buildings in Mexico. They get to him and they were telling him, hey, they're like playing soccer just next to the murals, and he's like, I don't care, I already paint them, no? And there is like this big neglect in my community about the importance of the value that your art can have or your actions can have to other people. And I believe that we need to encourage people, again, like chefs, writers, everyone who believes that they can be a little bit more contributing to others, that they think that they are doing is also important. We often tend to devalue the work that creative people is doing. And I feel like once that we encourage people to give more importance to what they are doing, I think the communities can also benefit from that.
And I think that segues nicely. So preservation is powered by passion, right? We're passionate about stuff, but we've created these restrictions that have limited our ability to have ambition. I want preservation to be powered by ambition to change the constructs, ambition to try new strategies and be okay if they fall short. Not everything's a home run by any stretch. I will happily tell you about my workshops that have never doing those again. But we have to be ambitious and we can't be complacent, because complacency is what's leading to declining conference registration numbers. Complacency is leading to stagnating donors for our nonprofits. We have to be ambitious to push for this change, and because we want preservation for future generations, and we want them all to be as excited about it as we are. And I truly believe that when you push yourself to be creative, like Carlos is saying, then it just opens doors, opens connections. And I'm just so happy you all had us today. And I'm really excited to see Carlos's scanned in posters for us so that we can all have a little poster to put on our fridge from tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you guys. And I thank you also to Chris Merritt. Thanks to everyone for being here. This was such an inspiring talk. We really, really appreciate your time. And thank you so much for going a little over with us so that we could make sure to get in all of the great questions. So like we started off saying, this is our flagship kickoff event for the month. So we've got cool events going on all month. If you liked this, you might be really interested in a couple of things coming up in the next couple of weeks. Amber Anderson from the Utah SHPO will be talking about historic tax credits, some really successful projects, and then some things that she would love to see come across her desk. Maybe you've got something in mind. And also Steve Cornell, our historic architect, will be talking about historic preservation here in Utah. So we can continue these conversations, but thank you again so much to Sarah and Carlos and Chris. This has been so fantastic having you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone have a good night.
Thank you so much.